It's interesting, it's challenging, it's important. And to be working in technology on something that's timely and relevant, I think is a real privilege. What I would also say, though, is it's a very challenging domain to work in because there are a number of different opinions, a number of difficult choices that need to be made, the policy requirements around this. There's a difficult corner whichever way you turn.
Welcome to the Shipping Podcast, where I meet interesting maritime professionals sharing their passion for the shipping industry and their everyday job. I am your host. My name is Lena Gothberg. Hello, Shipping Podcast listeners, and welcome to the 159th episode of the Shipping Podcast. This is the podcast where you hear me talk with maritime professionals about the maritime industry, where we are and where we are heading. If you are here for the first time, make sure to follow the Shipping Podcast on your podcast platform of choice and become part of the tribe that gets to listen to new episodes as soon as they are released. We are all affected by the pandemic right now. Seafarers are among those more affected than the rest of us who are still healthy and working. Part of being a seafarer is traveling to and from the workplace, something that the pandemic has almost made impossible. Governments around the world have suspended international flights, closed borders, ports and airports, and imposed travel restrictions to limit the spread of the coronavirus. This has left thousands of seafarers stranded on ships, with no prospect of being repatriated. An estimate by the International Maritime Organization, the IMO, says that about 200,000 seafarers remain on board commercial vessels right now and has not been able to return home. My heart goes out to you. You are truly the unsung heroes of this pandemic. Many high-level discussions have taken place to ensure that seafarers are recognized as key workers. Key worker designation for seafarers is essential to exempt them from specific COVID-related travel restrictions, allowing them to travel between their country of residence and the ships, and to be repatriated at the end of their contracts. But it will also have an impact on what is coming now, the vaccination that we are all waiting for. It is the prerogative of national governments to establish priority lists for vaccination. So once again, the high-level discussions about the important work that seafarers do is taking place. And we have seen some nations taking the lead in this respect. But I've been thinking about this for a while and wondering how it would be possible for a seafarer to prove that he or she has been vaccinated and or have a negative test to show when traveling to the workplace. And then I heard about the IBM Digital Health Pass and wanted to find out more. So, in this episode, I am presenting someone who is not working in the maritime industry, but is a digital expert focusing on the Digital Health Pass, something I think we are all interested in. This could be a game changer for the seafarers, and maybe for all of us. This is Anthony Day. He's a blockchain partner for global business services at IBM in Ireland. And he also happens to be a podcaster. I enjoyed speaking with Anthony last week so much, and I really hope that you will as well. This is Anthony Day for you. Welcome to the Shipping Podcast. Could you please introduce yourself?
Hi, thanks, Liana. My name's Anthony Day. I'm a partner in IBM and I focus on digital transformation and blockchain technology.
And what is your background? How did you end up there?
So I'm a strategist by training. So I worked in a company called Monitor Group, which was one of the East Coast US strategy houses founded by the likes of Michael Porter and a number of MIT and Harvard alums, which is a fantastic place to do your training. Have worked in consultancy with the likes of Deloitte, working eventually around the area of digital strategy, which is helping organizations to make difficult choices around use of technology in relation to how they grow, how they work, how they engage their customers. And eventually, what I find is one of the most interesting and most challenging areas to think about digital strategy is around blockchain, or the idea of business networks, where you're not just trying to transform a company individually, you're actually trying to transform an entire industry, or you're trying to get multiple companies to work together to develop technology, which is about as interesting and challenging as it gets.
Wow.
And then imagine the last 12 months has been spent focusing on digital health passports, IBM Digital Health Pass, which is about getting an entire world to agree on a set of standards, getting multiple governments and the public sector and private sector working together to enable getting people out of their bedrooms, out of where they are, into work, travel, entertainment. It doesn't get any bigger than that either.
And how do you do that?
Very slowly and very deliberately, I think is the learning over the last 12 months. And I realize this could become a very, very long podcast, so I'm going to try and keep it relatively brief if I can. But the idea of health credentials and helping individuals to have control over their own health data is not new. It's not unique to the pandemic. It's something that has been worked on for many, many years, even prior to today. What the COVID-19 pandemic did give us is a requirement for the management of health credentials at a scale we've never considered before. Right? We're familiar with the idea of yellow fever certificates, of vaccinations for certain countries or certain immigration requirements, but not for all international travel. Right? It is at a level much, much, much greater than it's ever been. And so the idea of how do we create, how do we trust, how do we verify the health of individuals on a global scale is one of the biggest digital transformation challenges of our time. And so it starts on a few different levels. Firstly, what's the policy? How do we think about the requirements for how do we identify somebody as healthy or low risk, or how do we reduce risk in countries, whether that's around people working in certain environments, about mass gatherings. Immigration obviously is a particularly critical concern here. And those are matters of policy defined by governments. And for a lot of governments, this particular type of pandemic is a relatively new challenge. So there are lots of very, very smart people working very hard to think about this with potentially limited sets of data. Everybody can take their own perspective on whether there's bias in that data, or whether some of the approaches that have been taken have got bias to them. But ultimately, we've got to think about what's the national strategy around what's required of us. Then we start thinking about, well, how do we enable that? So what we don't want to do is to create bias. What we don't want to do is have a solution that's not equitable, that's where there's any form of discrimination between individuals. So what we're talking about primarily is somebody healthy? Can they demonstrate that they are low risk for COVID-19 in the setting they're about to enter? Whether that's an aircraft, whether that's a ship, a helicopter, an oil rig, whether that's going to a theater or to a football match. The answer there is somebody needs to verify that I have low risk. That could be defined as I'm vaccinated. I have received 1 or 2 stages of a vaccine. It could mean that I have been tested for COVID. I've had a negative test of a certain type 48 hours before I attend. It could be that I have recovered from COVID, that I've proven to have had the virus and have no longer got it afterwards. There's a number of different ways. It could be that I have red hair and I'm over 6'5", right? Now, that's a bit of an unusual example, but the credentials, the requirements could be anything. And all we're looking to do is how can we demonstrate that and allow that to be in the control of the citizen when they present themselves to wherever they're trying to go. Now, the enemy of this system is paper, because as you can imagine, paper is inefficient, easily copied, easily lost, easily defrauded, and is particularly challenging. So if you're trying to go through an airport and everybody has to present 5 different pieces of paper, and we have to look at the authenticity of those pieces of paper, the administrative burden, the amount of time, the resulting queuing that's going to be required in what was previously a very streamlined process. You check in, you show your boarding pass, you show your passport, and off you go. You start adding paper and bureaucracy to that process, it's going to break very quickly. And so what we've got to try and solve for is accessibility, inclusivity as much as possible, but streamlined digital processes that are trustworthy as much as possible. And that's where the technology sits underneath and enables the policy.
And how will I be able to actually demonstrate that I am vaccinated, healthy, and I'm allowed to travel?
Got you. So the first part of this is what's the record? What's the credential? So if you go to a healthcare provider, the National Health Service, a private hospital, and go and get tested, or you go and have a vaccination, there'll be a record for that. In the same way as if you go and get a flu jab, if you go and have surgery on your ankle, as I recently have, there's going to be a record somewhere in a system of that event having happened to you. So there will be already a contract between you and the healthcare provider saying, I consent to being tested, I consent to having surgery, and the hospital will keep a record of that activity for regulatory purposes, for general record keeping, and also because in future you may want to access your medical records as a citizen, as is your right. So that already exists. That system, that technology already exists, and we're not looking to change that in any way. Right? The privacy around your data, the GDPR compliance, HIPAA compliance, whatever it might be that a hospital has to do in relation to your data doesn't change. What we're looking to do is to take that data that exists in a hospital system, turn that into a certificate, turn that into a credential that you as an individual can hold in digital or paper form and present to somebody else. And when they check it, when they scan it, when you upload it, when you share it with them at your consent, they can then search a platform that says, this was issued by somebody we trust. It includes the data that we need, that the parameters around what credential you're showing. Maybe it's a vaccine that requires 2 stages and you've had the second stage, that the sample you gave for the test was within 48 hours. When you query that credential, the results come back as yes or no. You're not sharing my name. You're not necessarily sharing my passport details. You're just saying, based on what I would like to know, is that correct for the individual presenting a credential to me? And in doing that, we maximize privacy. We maximize the ability to streamline that. We don't have to do too much in terms of transformation to the existing hospital systems, which are already quite complex. And we enable that digitization in a trusted way.
I'm blown away already. I remember, I am a little bit older than you are. I remember this little yellow card I had to carry together with my passport when I was traveling in the very old days, way before the pandemic. But I'm also thinking about, we don't know how many pandemics there will be in the future. So there are different angles of this.
Absolutely. And I have traveled a lot of the world myself. I've been to something in the order of about 120 countries so far. I did a lot of overlanding through Africa, and I remember carrying very similar pieces of yellow paper with me. And, at various border points, at various controls, I was presenting that yellow piece of paper. And because it had a rubber stamp on it, or because it had some ink on it, it was therefore trusted. Now, for a small number of people who are doing cross-border or overlanding, those yellow fever certificates aren't necessarily going to spread a disease at a rate that we need to become concerned about worldwide. With COVID-19, I think that's a little bit different. And so that's why the analogy or the scalability of that yellow piece of paper is very different. And we're already seeing news stories and examples, and not to overinflate it, not to create hysteria because it's not necessary, but we have seen the use of fake credentials to get access to places, to cross borders. And that's what we're trying to avoid, is to maintain the integrity of borders, of systems, so that we can help give people control back to their lives as much as possible. And also in a way that's something that they can use and that's easy for them to use. So we're already used to opening an app, showing a boarding pass and getting on a plane, without having to queue, without having to, in most cases, even be in front of another individual. The experience we're looking to create isn't too much different. We're used to uploading a photo of our driver's license to renew certain things, to pay for our insurance, to do a whole bunch of stuff. The digital experience we're looking to enable isn't that much different. It just so happens that when it comes to health data, it seems like there's a greater stigma or a greater challenge or a greater concern. And also the implications on our privacy and what we get to do in our lives around travel, around work, around lockdowns and all that sort of stuff has a whole bunch of connotations which are oftentimes really sad and very tragic and very difficult for a number of people. And that brings pain, concern, angst, anxiety. So we've just got to try and get as normal an experience as possible for as many people as we can.
And also going digital. Everyone keeps talking about cybersecurity on that topic.
Really, really important topic. And that goes across the entire spectrum. So how we look at the privacy of the apps on your phone, how we look at inclusion of biometrics if it's required, how we look at second forms of identity if we're using paper systems. There's a bunch of different physical and non-digital security that also comes with this. It's ultimately about verification. If we've got hospital systems that are already there, the base data, the existing data should already have a very secure, very well established existing security protocols, and they probably have already been attempted hacked a number of times. So there's already an institutional muscle memory around DevSecOps and security. So those existing established systems, we don't necessarily need to do much to. When we're talking about the sharing of credentials, right, sharing a test result or a vaccine result can be a sensitive topic. So if you're going into a theater, you don't necessarily want to show, my name's Anthony Day, I've had 2 stages of a Pfizer vaccine. Maybe that's something that, whether we've been vaccinated or not, is a sensitive topic. Socially, I just want to say I have credentials that are valid to let me in. And so we're returning red or green as opposed to returning, here's my entire history of testing. When you put a piece of paper in front of somebody, that's what you do. You have to have all of that metadata embedded in the piece of paper. So by default, you're already showing your name, probably your date of birth, the type of procedure that's happened, et cetera, et cetera. And that might be sensitive to people. And that's where we're looking to try and preserve privacy as much as possible.
I'm thinking about, this is a global thing. Everyone wants to have this kind of digital health pass. But does all hospitals and doctors all over the world keep digital records of the patients' journals and things like that?
That's a really good question. I think the answer is in some cases possibly not. So how can we enable the digitization where it's possible? Or how can we resort back to a paper-based system if we have to? Creation of the credential can start offline and be created digitally. So it can be that a health authority can issue credentials to an individual with a name, a date of birth, and a telephone number, or a home address or an email address. That starts with paper records. That's entirely possible, right? All you're doing is that you're trusting that issuer is an organization that we trust. It is the healthcare authority, or it is it's not, Anthony's Health Garage, where I've just started issuing random credentials here, there, and everywhere. There's an integrity required when you start onboarding participants onto that platform. There is an inherent trust in that model where you can't have the digital provenance back to, I know it was Anthony. There's a vaccine record that sits there with a certain series of numbers that then immediately gets transmogrified into a credential. I just realized I've used the word transmogrified, which I never thought I'd say on a podcast. I'm very proud of myself.
Maybe you should develop that a little bit.
I'll work on it. But essentially, you can't see the digital thread from when the event first happened in digital, so that you've got no likelihood of human error or manual error being intervened. But you're getting into very, very edge cases. And it doesn't necessarily have to be that it is 100% perfect 100% of the time in 100% of the countries. We're into pandemic management here in terms of the best of our ability. It's if somehow we get a digit wrong somewhere in terms of the manual processing of a credential, or all of these edge cases could happen. And it's not trying to make it perfect. It's trying to enable society to go back based on existing data and existing experiences as much as possible in as fast and as streamlined a way as we can. If somebody comes through with a positive result, that's generally not a great thing. If we miss, or if a certificate gets issued incorrectly, that's bad. But for 99.9% of the cases, we're trying to make sure we do that as best we can.
I'm thinking about the seafarers. So they are employed by someone. So there might be a crewing company or a ship owner who has a crew on board. And I presume that they do medical checkups anyhow, even though it might not be the national hospital where they are a citizen of that country. Is that something that will create a little bit even more challenges?
So in all of these instances, the testing or the healthcare providers could be public or private sector. So we work with a number of clients also specifically around IBM Digital Health Pass, where they have staff working abroad, traveling on charter flights or working offshore. So they might have their own private testing regime where that test is conducted privately. But in most cases, the information is then also passed to the national authority because it's a communicable disease. If there's a positive or negative result, typically that finds its way back to the national pandemic management system somehow. So you could look at creating the record at a national level that way if there's a centralized system, or you can create the record from the private testing company. It's relatively easy for them to onboard and have their back office system, their LIMS system, their lab system be connected to the HealthPass platform. So they can issue certificates as a trusted healthcare provider also. So it works for private and for public healthcare.
So how does it work? Are we going to dive into the blockchain, the big word that we didn't really want to go into? Or
we can delve as deep as you want, but I think let's start with a simple description of the process, because it really is not that much different to any existing healthcare process today. You are going to be tested or vaccinated or whatever happens based on your consent. You're going to go to the hospital, you're going to go to the provider, and something's going to happen. You're going to sign in, you're going to give them your name, date of birth, a proof of identity, and you will take a test, or you will have a vaccination completed, and a record will be kept of that information. So that's pretty much as normal. Nothing new, nothing particularly scientific here. What will then happen in the background is that information that's captured by the hospital is converted into a credential. They are a member of a network, a platform called the Health Pass Network. They're an issuer in our terminology, which says they're able to issue credentials. They're a known organization. They've been KYC'd. They are known to the system. They are known to the national system. They're known to the participants as Hospital One or Healthcare Provider One. They will convert that digital record of an event having happened into a credential. So they will move your name, your date of birth, the metadata required, maybe that's around the location of the hospital, the type of vaccine, the unique serial number, and that will be created into a credential that is then sent to your mobile phone. You then accept that that credential is yours. You download it to your mobile phone. A record of that credential having been issued is then logged onto the platform to confirm that that has been issued. It has been issued by an issuer who we know, and there is an active and non-revoked credential for a test or a vaccine that exists on the platform. That is encrypted. There is no personally identifiable information related to that credential. It just sits on the platform. And then at the point where I, as a citizen, as a passenger, as a seafarer, need to board the vessel or need to board an aircraft, I will either present my credential in person. A lot of people have seen QR codes as a method for this, for showing your credential and then have it be scanned. Or in some cases, it can be uploaded before time in the same way as you can upload a driver's license. So you can upload that credential to be verified before you even leave your home. There's a number of different ways in which that can happen. But ultimately then the shipping company or the airline or your employer can verify that that credential is valid based on the things that they want to know. Have you had both stages of a vaccine? Was the test conducted within the last 48 hours? If that returns green, your ticket, your boarding pass, your access can be issued. If that returns red, not so much. And then you've got to go through the communication journey of saying, you haven't met the criteria here. You haven't shown us a credential that is correct. Have you sent the latest one? Have you got a correct credential? Have you double checked? If the answer is yes, and you still come back with a test that's too old, unfortunately, you don't gain access at this point in time. Please revert back to, these are the testing locations you can get tested, or go and speak to your HR representative or whoever it might be. That's the typical journey. The bit that sits underneath that, the platform where blockchain is used, is between the verifier and the issuer to say, we've created a credential and it is available. It's been digitally signed by the issuer, so we can trust it. Or when we look it up, we trust, or we identify that it is from a trusted party. And then the verifier can apply the business rules to the system, say, is this person in front of me demonstrating credential of the details that I require? It's really not too different to a boarding pass, except that you're not just having a boarding pass with a one-to-one relationship between you and the airline. It's a boarding pass that could have come from tens of thousands of hospitals that could be verified by tens of thousands of individuals. So those many-to-many type of relationships is where blockchain tends to be a good solution.
So why isn't my usual passport done in blockchain? Why do I have to carry that around?
That's a really good question, because that passport is issued by a central authority, and the verification approach for that passport is to a certain extent standardized and agreed. There are a number of solutions out there where they're looking at visa approvals or driver's license issuances or national ID issuances on a blockchain platform that allows that many-to-many relationship between the driver's license, the different approvals for health and safety or for certain credentials or for learning to be combined together so that it's easier for you to manage in a wallet or easier for those credentials to be refreshed. If you lose your passport today, how do you renew it typically?
I go to the police.
So a slightly complicated journey to reissue. And so another part of that is the reissuance of different identity credentials if you choose to. The fact is, a centralized body or centralized authority issuing a national certificate or a national passport is a model that can endure. It is appropriate for what it is at this point in time. That having been said, the journey of lost credentials, of verification of credentials like passports, is challenging. And so the data infrastructure that sits behind that issuance could be enabled by a multi-party system like blockchain, but doesn't necessarily have to be.
And also I hear all these different countries right now within EU, at least in Sweden and Denmark, they're all thinking about a Danish health pass or a Swedish health pass. And I feel like, oh my God, we need a global one. How will any authority in, let's say, if I'm traveling to South America, know anything about a Swedish health pass?
And that's the exact use case that we're talking about here. So in each jurisdiction, in each country, you're going to probably have a slightly different mix of how the healthcare is provided, how testing is conducted, how vaccination is conducted. It could be private organizations, it could be fully nationalized. The way in which the information is stored might exist in different data silos or different systems. So it's going to be very difficult to have a globally interoperable, standardized credential issuing system. It makes sense for that to be issued, at a national level. Also, there will be existing digital components of a national system, like potentially a national identity, a national healthcare identity, or a national healthcare app, which you might want to surface some of that capability in for local verification or some enabling local journeys in that country, which you don't want to take away that user experience from those citizens. It's to a large extent enabling and beneficial to keep that at a national level. What we do need to look at is global verification, an approach to verify. So that, as you will have seen maybe in the last couple of days, the EU released its digital green certificate framework, in which there's going to be certain requirements for the data payload of what's going to be there, what is acceptable in terms of how the data is presented in paper, QR code, and how verification of those credentials can be done. That's the area in which we're spending a good amount of time at the moment at a national and a regional level to be able to help understand the technology to enable that. Because it can be, at a very simple level, I scan a QR code, it presents a whole bunch of information to me on a screen, and I look at that and say, is this information accurate based on what the QR code tells me? But the QR code is really just a way of obfuscating or anonymizing information. So when you hit that QR code, it turns into a hyperlink, or it turns into a page of information. But I don't know that that information's been brought down from a server that's online and trusted and up to date. If I've printed my credential out and for some reason that test or that batch of vaccine has found to be ineffective and I had to revoke that credential, somebody's still carrying around a piece of paper that's not up to date. So you've got some challenges there around how you manage kind of real time or near real time or up to date credential management. So that's why technology can provide a significant role here. But what's coming first is the standards, and that's critically important.
I understand that you have a lot of things to think about. But it's also exciting, isn't it?
It's interesting, it's challenging, it's important. And to be working in technology on something that's timely and relevant, I think, is a real privilege. What I would also say, though, is it's a very challenging domain to work in because there are a number of different opinions, a number of difficult choices that need to be made, the policy requirements around this. There's a difficult corner whichever way you turn. Every choice that you make around digital, non-digital, speed of deployment, whether or not you choose to verify in certain domains or use cases. I don't think anybody wants to have to present their health credentials to go to a pub or to go to a restaurant, right? Nobody wants to have a system that is so invasive as to be depressing or a constant reminder of the situation we find ourselves in. What we want is appropriate use of the technology proportionally in places where it makes sense, where it's not more invasive than it needs to be. We want to be able to surface people's health credentials in a way that's easy to use and not part of a challenging or complicated or difficult to understand journey for people who are less digitally savvy. The sad part of this is there's an unhappy path every way you turn. And that's the difficult job that policymakers have to make. That's the challenging part around use of data. Different people will have different perspectives on vaccines and whether that's something that they choose to opt into or not. And different people will have different views on masks. I've had any number of different comments on posts or podcasts that I've done at different ends of the spectrum of, cheering us on and telling us that we're the devil. And this is the worst thing in the history of suppression of society. It's really complicated as a domain. All we're trying to do is the best of our ability to digitally enable systems that already exist to allow citizens, passengers, and ourselves to get out of our bedrooms and get back to some degree of normality. And if all of this technology goes away in 12 months' time, more the better. Or if it gets repurposed for the benefit of citizens in other contexts, right? Look at what open banking and the ability for banks and banking data to be connected has done for financial literacy. You could look at the same benefit potentially if orchestrated in a privacy-preserving way to be relevant for humans in terms of their health management and wellness management. I don't know half of the things, or I've probably forgotten half of the things that happened to me over the last 10, 20 years of my life in terms of, different blood tests, different operations and procedures, and different BMI measurements and so on and so forth. If I had more of that information or someone could help me interpret it, maybe that could do some really interesting things for how I help stay on the planet longer and healthier. Let's see. But, first things first, let's focus on getting people back to a normal life.
Have you been in contact with the maritime industry before? In your occupation, I mean.
I've had various different dalliances with parts of the maritime industry, not least of which I spent a little bit of time crossing the Black Sea on a cargo ship between Azerbaijan and Turkmenistan, which was one of the most interesting nautical journeys I've ever been on. If you haven't been in the bowels of a Soviet-era engine room, then you really haven't lived, I don't think. I've probably also taken 2 or 3 years off my life just from the fumes. But they're a very friendly bunch. We had a lovely cup of tea down there. I think, I've worked in container shipping projects. I've worked in bulk shipping projects. I have huge passion for the industry because it's, if you'll allow me the simple metaphor, it's big boys' toys, right? It's big movements, it's big vessels, it's complicated, it's waves and oceans and seafaring, and it's fascinating. The mechanics behind the supply and demand of ships and vessels, that the Norwegians are the best friends of the Greeks and have been for decades, because of their ability to read and or manipulate the market, depending on who you talk to, is a fascinating but very, very basic understanding of supply and demand. It's beautiful. And so I have a lot of love. I have a lot of interest. Martijn Thijssen from the Port of Rotterdam has been on my podcast, Blockchain Won't Save the World. And it was one of the most interesting episodes of how to think about digitizing port operations. So unfortunately, I have never skippered a vessel. I'm not much of a sailor myself, but I have a lot of love and a lot of respect for the guys out there doing it.
You make me so happy, because usually people don't know anything about the maritime industry. And one of my soapboxes in my podcast is, how can we become more visible? But you just, I got so happy that you proved me wrong this time.
I think it's just about storytelling. If people knew more about the work that was done, about the movements, about the soap opera behind the different components of the industry, if people knew more about offshore engineering and drilling and all of the work that goes on out there, it's utterly, utterly fascinating. You can spend days, if not weeks, reading up about drill string operations and floating vessels and supply rigs and just bunkering as a concept is just fascinating. That stevedore is a phrase that's probably not well known to most. It's something that I think should be essential learning for everybody, not just if you've read Pirates of the Caribbean or any kind of similar pirate folklore books. But there's a huge amount of fascination in the industry that I think more people need to learn about. And if your podcast is helping people to surface some of that fascination, more power to you.
Thank you. And I am happy to say that the women are now breaking into this area. And I see the young women, 35, bringing in the knowledge, like, for instance, blockchain, into our industry. And I get so happy when I see it. So the big boys are still playing, but the smart young women are now, surfing in here.
And I'm delighted to hear that.
So what's the name of your podcast? Could you please tell the audience?
For sure. So the name of my podcast is called Blockchain Won't Save the World. It's a somewhat ironical title, given I've been working with blockchain technology for the past 5 years. But the point of the show is, I guess a little bit like yours, is to help bring to life real stories, to help demystify some of the examples of how blockchain is being used in supply chain, in port operations, in shipping, for identity management. The current season of the show, we're looking at country-specific case studies on what's happening with the technology. So we've virtually been to Brazil, Israel, Malta, Germany, India. Netherlands is coming up next. I feel like there's got to be a Scandinavian episode coming up soon as well. So it's a really great way of helping to tell stories of people doing amazing work, to get to meet people who are doing really interesting things, and hopefully demystify and simplify some of the concepts that people feel for some reason unaddressable or difficult to get their heads around at this point in time, when really it's actually quite simple.
Thank you, Anthony. Thank you for taking the time to speak to me. I've been so curious, and I really want people to understand a little bit more about this digital health pass and why it's important and how it's actually done.
Well, thank you, Lena, for the opportunity. And if nothing else, hopefully I've laid out some of the considerations of how to think about it. People should still have their own opinions. People should still voice those opinions as vociferously as they can. It's our right to do so, and it's a complicated space. But if I've given a little bit of context, a little bit of background to people to help engage with the topic, then that's mission accomplished for me. And thank you again for the kind invitation.
Thank you, Anthony. I am so grateful that you took the time to answer all my questions and explain how a digital health pass works. If we now try to translate all of what Anthony said into the maritime industry and think about the process of a seafarer getting the green light to go to the ship to start working. Every seafarer must have a medical examination before he or she starts traveling. And this health check is done in the country where the seafarer lives. And that is where the medical journal is kept. You heard Anthony say that it is the national health authorities that sets the standards for testing and vaccinating in each country. And this is the base for the National Digital Health Pass. So we are back to square one, where the high-level maritime leaders needs to get the national health authorities to understand the complexity of the maritime industry and why the seafarers, the designated key workers, needs a globally accepted national digital health pass. Airlines will need to be able to accept many different digital health passes, in the same way that shops need to accept multiple credit cards. And from what I understand, this is an area where a lot of work is being done right now to set standards. I asked Anthony if it's public knowledge yet, if they are working with any governments around the world. His reply was that they are currently working with the German government and with the state of New York in the United States. Surely there is more work done behind the scenes, as IBM is also part of the standard working groups within the World Health Organization, WHO, Good Health Pass Initiative, and Vaccination Credential Initiative. I look forward to see the results of these working groups. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I certainly learned a lot myself. And if you feel comfortable sharing this episode with others that you think would benefit from listening to Anthony, you have my word to do that. This is a lot to digest. And if you're interested in blockchain, I have done 2 episodes prior to this. You just have to go to shippingpodcast.com and search for Deanna MacDonald in episode 62. She gave me a crash course in blockchain. And then in episode 75, I met Norbert Kofferhafen to speak about the Maersk IBM blockchain project. Those episodes might be interesting for you to listen to. But I would probably come back on this topic. I need to go now. So, until the next time, from me to you, over and out. Thank you for listening to the Shipping Podcast. Don't forget to tell everyone that you meet that there is a shipping podcast available and that they should download it and listen to the maritime professionals who are sharing their passion for the shipping industry.